On Christmas Eve, 1884, Georgia Whitlow sat in Murphy's roadside inn, the weight of her broken heart pressing down on her more than the chill in the air. The wedding dress she wore was caked with mud, its once pure white now stained with both dirt and tears. Her stomach growled painfully, but she had no money to pay for food and no family to turn to. Her ring finger, once adorned with a beautiful engagement ring, was now bare, the gold band a distant memory. The man she had been about to marry had left her at the altar that very morning, choosing her beautiful sister, Willow, instead. She had tried to hold back her tears when he'd spoken those cruel words, but the humiliation had been too much. Her father's bitter words, his cold, judgmental gaze, had only made it worse. "Should have been her from the start," he had said, his voice filled with regret. The whispers of the guests had echoed in her ears as she fled from the church, still in her wedding dress, running from the reality she couldn't escape. Now, hours later, Georgia sat alone in the inn, her body shivering from both the cold and the weight of her grief. The inn was warm and bustling with holiday cheer. Families huddled together, sharing hearty meals, laughter filling the air. It was the kind of scene Georgia had once dreamed of, the kind she had imagined for herself and Thomas. But that dream had crumbled into nothing, and now she was left with only a hollow stomach and a heart broken beyond repair. She had no money, no place to stay. The stagecoach had already left town, and the last of the shops had closed their doors for Christmas. As the evening grew darker, she realized how close the world was to turning its back on her. The wind howled outside, and the snow fell thick and heavy, a dangerous storm settling in. She couldn't stay out there, and the innkeeper's wife, Mrs. Murphy, had already shown kindness, but there was nothing more she could do. With a sigh, Georgia stood up, ready to leave and face the bitter cold once again. But her steps faltered when she noticed a man sitting in the far corner booth of the inn. He was a rancher, weathered and rugged, his hands rough and scarred, eyes full of something she couldn't quite place. His dark hat rested on the table before him, and though he was eating alone, he wasn't watching the festive scene around him. Instead, his gaze lingered on her, quiet, almost too observant. Georgia couldn't quite meet his eyes, her pride still holding her back. She had been abandoned by the one person she had trusted most. The last thing she wanted was to appear as though she needed anything from a stranger. As Georgia turned to leave, she heard his voice, low and steady, just as she reached the door. "Forgive my forwardness, miss, but I couldn't help noticing." His voice trailed off as he stood up from the booth and stepped toward her. His presence was unexpectedly gentle, but there was something resolute in the way he carried himself. "I'd like to offer you something. Please sit with me." Georgia hesitated, her pride warring with the gnawing hunger in her stomach. She had nothing left to lose. Slowly, she lowered herself into the seat across from him, watching as he ordered a full Christmas meal from Mrs. Murphy, who gave him a nod of understanding. It was a meal fit for a family, with turkey, potatoes, cranberry sauce, and steaming gravy. When the platter was set before her, he slid it closer to her, pushing it gently across the table. "No one should go hungry on Christmas," he said quietly, his voice calm but sincere. "Especially someone who's already lost too much today." His eyes met hers, as if he could see the broken pieces of her heart and yet didn't ask for an explanation. He just understood. For a moment, Georgia couldn't bring herself to touch the food. Her hands trembled, not just from the cold, but from the shame she still carried. But the hunger inside of her was too powerful, too consuming. Without another word, she took the fork in her hand and dug into the meal, the warmth and comfort of the food filling her empty stomach. As she ate, tears blurred her vision, mixing with the turkey and potatoes on her plate. When she finally looked up, the rancher had not moved. He sat across from her, silently observing her, but there was no judgment in his gaze, only a quiet understanding. "I have a ranch," he said quietly, his voice breaking the silence. 10 miles west. Lost my wife 3 years back, and I've been cooking my own meals poorly ever since. He paused, watching her closely. If you need work in a safe place, the offer stands. George's hand trembled as she held the fork. She had two choices: stay here in this freezing inn, alone, or accept the stranger's offer. The world outside was cold and unforgiving, and the storm was worsening. She could feel the weight of her choices pressing down on her pride battling with the desperate need for safety. For a fleeting moment, the idea of a safe haven, even with a stranger, seemed like the better option. Outside, church bells rang, calling people to evening service. Georgia stared out the window, wondering if this could be the answer to her prayer, or if it would be yet another mistake. The rancher watched her, waiting, patient, offering no pressure. And for the first time in a long while, Georgia felt as though she wasn't completely invisible. There was a choice ahead of her, and she wasn't alone in making it. The bells rang again, and she made her decision. The next morning, Dustin McCade, the rancher who had offered Georgia a safe haven, retrieved his horse and wagon, preparing to leave the inn and take her to his ranch. Mrs. Murphy, sympathetic but unable to do more than provide a few blankets and some basic provisions for the journey, offered Georgia a gentle smile as she handed her the supplies. "He's a good man," Mrs. Murphy whispered. "Lost his wife in childbirth. Been alone since." Georgia nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She climbed into the wagon, still wearing the tattered wedding dress beneath a heavy coat Dustin had lent her. As the wagon rumbled away, the small town gradually faded behind them, swallowed by the thick, swirling snow. The weight of the morning's events still hung over her, but there was no turning back now. The man beside her didn't ask about her past, didn't press for details, which, for some reason, felt like a kindness. The silence between them was heavy at first, neither of them knowing quite how to bridge the gap. But slowly, Georgia began to speak. "My sister Willow," she said softly, staring at the snow-covered ground beneath the wagon wheels. "She was always the beautiful one. Thomas courted me because I was practical, reliable. I thought if I worked hard enough, I could earn his love. But this morning, he realized he wanted passion, not comfort." She blinked away the tears that had threatened to rise once more. Dustin didn't interrupt, just listened, his eyes focused ahead, but his silence was an offering of space, of understanding. After a moment, he spoke, his voice low but steady. "I understand something about being replaced," he said quietly. "Death replaced me with loneliness." Georgia turned to him then, surprised. "I lost my wife 3 Christmases ago," he continued. "She died giving birth to our son. Both of them." The grief in his eyes was familiar, and Georgia felt a pang of understanding. They both carried their losses like heavy burdens, unspoken yet always present. As the wagon journeyed through the wilderness, they shared their quiet pain, their stories unfolding in small pieces, both of them finding solace in the shared silence and the knowledge that for the first time in a long time, someone understood. The journey took hours, but when they finally arrived at McCade Ranch, George's breath caught in her throat. The place was modest, but there was something undeniably real about it. The barn and stable were well kept, the pastures neat despite the winter. The main house stood tall, though the shutters needed paint, and the garden was overgrown. It wasn't the grand, bustling home she had once imagined for herself and Thomas, but it was safe. Inside, the house was functional but empty, a place that felt lived in but not truly loved. Photographs, once proudly displayed, were now turned face down, and the small Christmas tree in the corner had no decorations. Dustin showed her to a guest room that he had prepared in case someone ever came, though the bed was still neatly made, waiting for a guest who had never arrived. "You're free to leave any time, no questions asked," he said, his voice a touch softer now, a little more vulnerable. "But if you want work, the job is yours. I'll pay fair. Just help out around the house. Cook, clean. I eat at dawn and dusk. She nodded, the quiet kindness in his words offering her a sense of relief. He left her to her room, but not before laying out a simple nightgown, the soft fabric washed and cared for, as if to show that he had thought of her comfort. Georgia lay in the bed that night, her body sore from the long walk and the emotional toll of the past day. As she lay there, looking out the window at the snow-covered fields, she realized that the silence in the house wasn't cold. It was just a reflection of the stillness in her own heart. She cried quietly, a mixture of grief, relief, and fear overwhelming her. She had no idea what her future held, but at least for now, she was safe. From downstairs, she heard Dustin's boots pacing the floor, the sound of someone else who was equally uncertain. She couldn't explain why, but in that moment, she felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe this was the beginning of something different. Tomorrow, she would find out. The first week at McCade, ranch passed in a blur of routine. Georgia woke early every morning, tending the stove to prepare a hot breakfast while Dustin worked in the barn, feeding the animals and checking the fences. She found a sense of purpose in these small tasks, a quiet satisfaction in knowing she was needed. On Christmas morning, she made a full spread of biscuits, gravy, eggs, bacon, and coffee. Something hearty and familiar, something that felt like home. When Dustin sat down to eat, the emotion on his face was unmistakable. "I'd forgotten what home smelled like," he said, his voice thick with something she couldn't quite place. They ate together in silence, a comfortable, unspoken bond forming between them as they shared this simple meal. After breakfast, Dustin asked if she would help him with something. He pulled out a box of ornaments, their edges dulled with age, and asked her to decorate the Christmas tree. As she unwrapped the fragile decorations, he shared stories about his late wife, Sarah, and how she had loved Christmas. "She always made the holidays feel special," he said, his voice laced with nostalgia. "I can't bring myself to do it without her, but I suppose maybe honoring her means celebrating what she loved." Georgia, with her quiet empathy, understood, and together they decorated the tree, each ornament holding a memory of Sarah that Dustin shared with her in hushed tones. It was a small act of healing for both of them. As the days passed, their routine became more settled, the rhythm of their daily lives weaving them into something resembling a family. By day, Georgia cleaned the house, mended clothes, and organized the neglected spaces. Slowly, the house began to come alive again, reflecting her care and attention. In the evenings, they ate together by the fire, and Dustin would read aloud from the newspaper while she mended more clothes or prepared for the next day. The moments between them grew more comfortable, more familiar. They shared small conversations, nothing too personal, but enough to let each other in. Neither of them acknowledged the growing awareness of the other's presence, the accidental touches as they passed each other in the hall, or the lingering glances across the room. Neither was brave enough to admit the attraction that simmered beneath the surface, both of them afraid of getting hurt again. But as the days turned into weeks, Georgia found herself regaining a sense of self that she had lost when Thomas abandoned her. Her confidence grew as she took ownership of the ranch house, transforming it from a cold, neglected space into a home. Dustin, too, began to notice the changes. One evening, as they sat down to supper, he remarked quietly, "You've made this place feel alive, more than I ever could." George's face flushed with warmth, and she felt something deep inside her stir, a reminder that she was more than just the practical, reliable woman she had always been told to be. She was strong, capable, and deserving of more. In their conversations, they began to open up more. Georgia shared how she had always felt overshadowed by Willow, how her parents had favored her beautiful sister, and how she had always been the one left behind. "Thomas was my chance to be chosen," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought if I worked hard enough, I'd be worth choosing." Dustin's eyes darkened with quiet anger as he listened. No one should have made you feel like that, he said firmly. You're worth more than anyone ever gave you credit for. In return, Dustin shared his own pain, how he felt responsible for his wife's death, how he had isolated himself in his grief, punishing himself for not protecting her. I thought I didn't deserve another chance, he said quietly. But maybe I'm finally ready for one. They didn't know it yet, but in that moment, their shared pain was beginning to heal them both. Small gestures of care began to emerge. Dustin learning to trust her in the kitchen, letting her teach him how to make biscuits the way she liked them. And Georgia, though she didn't say it, was learning to trust him, to believe that not all kindness came from pity. As the new year approached, the unspoken question hung between them. What would happen when the week's deadline came? Would Georgia stay? Would Dustin ask her to? Neither of them spoke it aloud, but they both knew that things were changing. The house felt different now, warmer, filled with more than just the sound of winter wind howling outside. It was filled with hope, though neither was brave enough to say it. Then, one evening, the first real conflict arose when Georgia mentioned needing to find something permanent. I'll need to find a permanent situation soon, she said quietly. I don't want to overstay my welcome. Dustin froze, his face darkening with uncertainty. You're not happy here? He asked, his voice tight. She hesitated, the words caught in her throat. I'm too happy, she admitted. That's the problem. It's not mine to keep. The silence between them was thick with tension, and for the rest of the evening, neither spoke. Georgia stood by the window later that night, staring out at the snow, feeling a distance growing between them that she couldn't name. Across the yard, Dustin's shadow moved behind his window, pacing restlessly. She longed to cross the distance between them, to tell him that this wasn't a temporary happiness, but fear held her back. Tomorrow, they would have to talk. Tomorrow, everything would change. But she wasn't sure if it would break apart or finally come together. A week after their first meaningful conversation, Dustin announced they would be making a trip into town to stock up on supplies for the ranch. Georgia hesitated, uneasy at the thought of leaving the safety of McCade Ranch and venturing back into the world that had abandoned her so cruelly. What if someone recognizes me? She asked, her voice tinged with fear. Dustin's steady gaze met hers, his expression firm yet gentle. Then they'll see you're doing well, he said, his tone assuring. You're not the same person who was left at the altar. You've moved forward. She swallowed hard, not sure if she believed him, but she didn't argue. When the wagon started down the snow-covered path toward town, Georgia couldn't shake the feeling that everyone in that small, familiar place would look at her with pity, or worse, judgment. The ride was quiet at first, both of them lost in their own thoughts, but Georgia couldn't help but feel the weight of Dustin's presence beside her. As they arrived in town, the bustling streets, decorated for Christmas, seemed foreign to her now. She was no longer the bride-to-be. She was the woman abandoned, the one everyone whispered about. Dustin remained close by, his silent support a comfort as she stepped off the wagon. In the general store, as he ordered the necessary provisions, Georgia quietly slipped to the fabric section, her fingers tracing the colorful bolts of cloth. She found a simple calico print, beautiful in its own way. Dustin, ever observant, appeared beside her, his hand brushing hers as he reached for the fabric. You need new clothes, he said, his voice gentle but determined. I can't have my cook walking around in borrowed things. She hesitated, unsure how to respond, but before she could protest, he insisted on buying the fabric for her, a quiet kindness that made her heart swell with emotion. They moved on to the counter, but just as they were about to pay, a loud voice interrupted their quiet exchange. Well, if it isn't the Christmas bride. The voice belonged to Maeve Talcott, a sharp-eyed woman whose gossip had a way of spreading through the entire town like wildfire. Georgia froze, her body tensing as the words hit her with a sickening force. All eyes in the shop turned toward her, and she felt the familiar sting of shame and embarrassment rise within her chest. Maeve's voice rang out, loud and unrelenting. "I heard about your little situation," she said, her eyes gleaming with malicious curiosity. "Thomas and Willow are staying at the hotel? Honeymooning, I hear. Everyone understands why he chose her instead. But I must say, you've landed on your feet quickly." The implication was clear, and George's stomach churned. The words, meant to wound, hit their mark. She wanted to flee, to run from the shop in the town, but something deep inside her refused to let that happen. Instead, she stood up straighter, squaring her shoulders. "Mr. McCade offered me honest work," she said, her voice trembling slightly but carrying enough strength to make her words ring true. "I'm grateful for his kindness, and that's all anyone needs to know." She forced herself to meet the eyes of the onlookers, the weight of their judgment hanging in the air like an oppressive cloud. Maeve looked at her with thinly veiled disdain, but said nothing further. It was then that Dustin stepped in, his presence a shield between her and the cruel whispers of the town. He didn't step in front of her to protect her in the traditional sense. He stood beside her, his voice cold but measured. "Miss Whitlow is my employee," he said, his words firm, cutting through the tension in the room. "Her arrangements are none of your concern, and if anyone feels the need to spread rumors, they'll have to answer to me." Maeve faltered, her smirk fading as she realized the rancher wasn't backing down. The other patrons of the store seemed to shrink under Dustin's gaze, and after a few uncomfortable moments, Maeve turned, her sharp heels clicking against the wooden floor as she left with her usual air of superiority. The silence that followed felt heavy, but Dustin didn't say anything more. He simply guided Georgia back to the wagon, his hand placed gently on her back, as if to reassure her that everything was going to be all right. As they passed the hotel on their way out of town, Georgia's heart skipped a beat when she saw them. Thomas and Willow, sitting at a table in the restaurant, laughing together. Willow, radiant and full of life, leaned toward Thomas as he spoke to her, his eyes full of admiration. It was as if the world had forgotten that she even existed. The tears welled up in George's eyes before she could stop them. The image of the two of them, so perfect, so happy, only served to remind her of her place in this story. She had been the one left behind, the one who wasn't chosen. Dustin noticed the way she froze as she looked at them, and his jaw tightened in response. He followed her gaze, his expression hardening, though he didn't speak. "Georgia," he said softly, "don't let them see you like this. You got nothing to prove to them." But she couldn't help it. The pain of seeing them, so right for each other, made the wound in her heart open once again. The tears she'd fought to hold back began to spill over, and she quickly wiped them away, ashamed of her weakness. Dustin, however, didn't let her withdraw. He was beside her, steady and strong, as they walked back to the wagon in silence. The ride back to the ranch was long and quiet. The town felt so far behind them, yet the sting of that encounter followed Georgia like a shadow, reminding her of the life she could never return to. At McCade Ranch, the door closed behind them, and for the first time in days, she felt the weight of everything she had been trying to escape. But Dustin didn't leave her alone in her pain. He stayed close, his presence a steady reminder that, though the world outside might never change, she wasn't facing it alone anymore. The following evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the snowstorm outside intensified, the sound of approaching horse hooves interrupted the quiet of McCade Ranch. Georgia was in the kitchen, preparing a simple supper, when she heard the unmistakable thud of boots on the porch. Her heart skipped a beat, and she rushed to the window, her breath catching in her throat as she saw a familiar figure. Her father, Abraham Whitlow, standing rigidly at the edge of the yard. Beside him, the sheriff shifted uncomfortably, his hat in his hands. Behind them, Thomas and Willow appeared, their presence a cruel reminder of what Georgia had lost. Georgia's blood turned cold. The past she had tried to bury had found her, and with it came the cold judgment she had hoped to escape. Dustin, who had been repairing a fence, stopped when he saw the group, his jaw tightening with a mix of concern and anger. Georgia, too, felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Her father, with his hard eyes and sharp words, had never been one to show affection. He only ever valued what was practical, and now he was here to claim what he believed was rightfully his. The daughter who should have been dutiful, the daughter who should have obeyed. Dustin stepped in front of her, his protective stance a quiet defiance. But she knew the battle that was about to unfold was one she had to face, too. As the door opened, her father's voice boomed across the room, his eyes narrowing as he saw her standing in the doorway. "Georgia," he said, his tone sharp as a knife. "It's time to come home." The words hit her like a slap, and she stood frozen in the doorway, the last vestiges of hope that had been growing inside her crumbling into dust. "You've shamed this family enough," her father continued, his gaze flickering to Dustin. "You've been living here unchaperoned with this man. It's indecent." Willow stood behind him, her expression one of smug superiority, a faint smirk playing on her lips. Thomas, at her side, looked uncomfortable but didn't speak. George's breath caught in her throat as the weight of her father's words settled around her. She had been abandoned, and now her father was treating her as though she had done something wrong. "She's an adult," the sheriff said, his voice hesitant, his discomfort palpable as he glanced between Georgia and the others. "She's free to make her own choices." But her father was having none of it. "A young woman alone with a man," he scoffed, dismissing the sheriff's words with a wave of his hand. "Her reputation's ruined. She'll come home where she belongs." George's pulse raced as she stared at him, her heart breaking all over again. This wasn't about her. It was about how she could be useful to him. Her father wasn't concerned with her happiness or well-being. He only wanted her back because Willow was gone, married now, and someone had to take her place in the house. "You need to come home," he repeated, his voice final, as though there was no other option. But Georgia saw the truth now. She saw the self-interest behind his cold words, the same self-interest that had always dictated their relationship. He didn't care that she had been left at the altar. He cared that Willow was gone and his household needed a woman to take her place. The realization hit her like a blow to the chest. Her father had never truly seen her for who she was. He had only ever seen her as someone to be used. But Georgia wasn't that woman anymore. She wasn't someone who would go back to a life of servitude, of feeling invisible and unimportant. She had found something different here at McCade Ranch, a place where she was seen, where she was valued for more than just her ability to cook and clean. She wasn't going to lose that, not for him, not for anyone. Before she could say anything, Thomas spoke up, his voice hesitant but well-meaning. "Georgia," he said, his eyes darting between her and Dustin. "Come with us. I can find you a respectable position in town. You don't need to stay here." His words were meant to be comforting, but they only made George's heart ache more. He hadn't cared enough to choose her when it mattered. He hadn't cared enough to stand by her when she needed him most. Now, he wanted to offer her a position, a life that would keep her in the shadows of his and Willow's happiness. But Georgia knew better now. She wasn't a charity case to be rescued. "She's fine here," Dustin interjected, his voice low and controlled, but his words carried weight. "I've treated her with nothing but respect, and I'm not going to let anyone talk down to her, least of all you." His eyes flashed with barely contained fury as he turned to face her father, and for a brief moment, Georgia saw something in him that mirrored the strength she had found in herself. Her father scoffed again, dismissing Dustin's words with a flick of his hand. "You have no idea what's best for her," he sneered. "She doesn't belong here. She belongs with us." Georgia stood taller now, the anger bubbling up inside her, ready to confront the man who had always made her feel like she was second best. "I don't belong with you," she said firmly, her voice shaking but strong. "I'm not ruined. I'm not a disgrace. I showed up. I said yes." And Thomas, she turned to him now, her heart heavy. "You change your mind." She saw Thomas flinch at the truth of her words. Her father's eyes flashed with anger, but Georgia didn't back down. "You need me to come home because Willow's gone, and you have no one else to take care of you," she said, her voice steady as she laid bare the ugly truth. Her father's face twisted with frustration as his true motivation was revealed. "You're wrong," he spat. "You don't understand." But Georgia wasn't listening anymore. Her heart was made up. "No," she said, her voice cold. "I understand perfectly." Just then, Dustin spoke again, his voice firm and resolute. "If you're here for her, you need to leave." He turned toward the sheriff, his posture unyielding. "She's staying here, and that's her decision." The sheriff nodded, clearly uncomfortable with the tension, but unwilling to get involved further. "I'll be on my way," he said softly. George's father, unwilling to accept defeat, muttered something under his breath before turning to leave. Thomas followed reluctantly, throwing one last glance at Georgia. Willow, however, lingered. She stepped toward Georgia, her expression softening for the first time. "Be happy, Georgia. I hope you find peace," she said quietly, the sincerity in her voice surprising Georgia. It wasn't much, but it was more than she had ever heard from her sister. As the door closed behind them, Georgia let out a long, shaky breath. The past had tried to drag her back, but it had no hold on her anymore. She was free. The days following the confrontation with her father felt heavy, but they also marked a turning point for Georgia. With her past finally behind her, she could see her future more clearly. One that was no longer shaped by the judgment of her family, but by the quiet, steady presence of Dustin McCade. They settled into an easy routine at the ranch, the days blending together in a peaceful rhythm. But a new tension simmered between them, one they both tried to ignore. Dustin had been patient, respecting her space, never pushing for more than what she was ready to give, but it was becoming increasingly difficult for both of them to ignore the unspoken connection that had been growing between them. Dustin began to do things properly, as he put it. He would no longer let their relationship linger in the gray area of kindness and necessity. He started to court her in earnest, his intentions clear, though he took his time, as if savoring each step. One morning, Dustin handed her a letter with a quiet, almost nervous smile. "I've written you something," he said, his voice unusually soft. Georgia took the envelope, opening it carefully. Inside, was a formal letter, his handwriting neat and deliberate. In it, he formally requested to court her, acknowledging their shared history and the respect he had for her strength and resilience. The formality of it took her by surprise, but it warmed her heart in a way she hadn't expected. She wrote back her acceptance, laughing softly at the simplicity of their growing bond. It was something different from what she had imagined, but it felt right. The next day, Dustin returned from town with a bundle wrapped in brown paper. He handed it to her with a knowing look. "For you," he said. "Not because you need it, but because I want you to have it." Georgia unwrapped the fabric, revealing a beautiful, rich shade of deep blue. It was dress material, simple yet elegant, and it made her chest tighten with emotion. For the first time, someone had given her a gift that wasn't motivated by obligation, pity, or practicality. It was a gift given purely for her. She had never been the recipient of such tenderness, and it filled her with a sense of worth she had never known before. As the week went on, their courtship continued, marked by small but meaningful gestures. One evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Dustin asked about her childhood, his voice sincere, his eyes soft with curiosity. Georgia, feeling safe for the first time in her life, opened up to him about the years spent living in the shadow of her beautiful sister, Willow, and the way her father had always treated her like she was just a tool for practicality. She shared how her mother's death had changed everything for her, leaving her to grow up too quickly. "I was always the one who could be relied upon," she said quietly. "But I never felt seen. Not by my father. Not by Thomas. Not by anyone." Dustin listened intently, his expression softening with each word. When she finished, he shared his own story, telling her about his parents' early deaths and how he had been forced to grow up too soon as well. "I never wanted to be alone again," he admitted, his voice rough with the weight of past regrets. "But I made myself that way, pushing everyone away, punishing myself for what happened to Sarah and the baby." Georgia reached for his hand, feeling an unspoken understanding between them. There was no judgment, no pity, just a shared recognition of the pain that had shaped them both. Later that week, Dustin suggested they attend church together, the first time either of them had stepped inside a building of worship in years. It was a Sunday morning, and the town was quiet beneath a thick blanket of snow. As they walked into the small church, side by side, Georgia felt a sense of belonging she hadn't known in a long time. The quiet whispers of the townsfolk, the cautious glances, they didn't matter. What mattered was the man beside her, standing firm in his quiet devotion to her. They sat in the pew together, a respectable distance between them, but their shared glances, the subtle way their hands brushed, said everything that words couldn't. After the service, Dustin introduced her to the congregation as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "This is Georgia Whitlow," he said, his voice steady and proud. "She'll be my wife." The words hung in the air, not just a promise, but a declaration to the town, to himself, to her. George's heart swelled with a mixture of warmth and surprise. It was simple, unadorned, but it was everything she had ever wanted: to be seen, to be chosen, to be enough. As the weeks went by, their bond deepened. The little moments they shared, working together in the kitchen, talking about their pasts, teaching each other new things, became the foundation of something stronger. Dustin even taught her how to ride a horse, his hands at her waist as he helped her onto the saddle, the warmth of his touch lingering longer than necessary. Their eyes met in a silent understanding, the growing attraction undeniable. But still, Dustin held back, refusing to cross a line that hadn't been spoken but was clear to both of them. Their first real kiss had almost happened one night. After an evening of cooking together, their hands dusted with flour, their laughter filling the space between them. But Dustin had pulled away, his voice thick with emotion. "Not yet," he had said quietly. "I want to do this right. I want to earn this." Georgia had been both disappointed and relieved, understanding that he wasn't rushing their connection, that he was taking his time because he respected her, because he cared for her. The days passed in a haze of small moments, each one bringing them closer, until finally, Dustin's patience wore thin. One evening, after a quiet supper, he took her hand and led her outside into the crisp night air. The stars were bright above, and the snow crunched beneath their boots as they walked to a small clearing near the barn. Dustin stopped, facing her, his eyes filled with earnestness. "Georgia," he began, his voice low but steady, "I've been asking myself this question every day, but I think I know the answer now." He took a deep breath, his hand reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small, simple ring. "Will you marry me?" His words were simple, but filled with more emotion than Georgia had ever imagined she would feel. For a moment, she couldn't speak, her heart racing in her chest. But then, looking into his eyes, she saw the truth there, the same truth that had been building between them all along. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Yes, Dustin McCade, I'll marry you." And in that moment, everything changed. The future she had once thought was lost, the love she had never dared to hope for, was finally hers. Dustin slid the ring onto her finger, and they stood together in the snow, their hearts full of promise, ready to face whatever came next together. The morning of their wedding dawned clear and cold, the sun casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground as Georgia woke in the guest room. The final morning she would spend as Georgia Whitlow. Her heart beat with a mixture of excitement and nerves, but mostly there was a profound sense of peace she had never felt before. Mrs. Miller arrived early to help her prepare, bringing with her a simple white dress, her own, carefully altered to fit George's form. "Every bride deserves white," Mrs. Miller had said, her voice warm with kindness. And as she placed the dress into George's hands, the simplicity of it made George's eyes well with grateful tears. As she stepped into the gown, her thoughts wandered briefly to the past. The wedding that had never been. The dress that had been meant for a man who had chosen someone else. But this was different. This time it was real. This time it was love. Mrs. Miller's hands were gentle as she arranged George's hair. And for the first time in a long time, Georgia felt beautiful in a way that wasn't tied to what someone else had expected of her. When the time came, she stood before the mirror, the woman who had been broken and abandoned, now standing tall in a dress that felt like a promise to herself, to Dustin, to everything they had built together. Meanwhile, Dustin was up before dawn, his nerves fraying with every passing minute. He stood before the mirror, adjusting his collar with shaking hands, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He was doing this, for Georgia, for them. But it wasn't just the wedding that had him unsettled. It was the realization that everything was about to change. He had spent so long living in the shadow of guilt, of the past. But now, standing in front of the mirror, he felt nothing but the desire to honor the woman he had come to love. After a quick breakfast, Dustin stepped outside for a moment of quiet, the cold air biting at his skin as he made his way to the small graveyard on the far side of the ranch, where Sarah was buried. He stood by her grave, the weight of his past heavy on his heart. And for a long moment, he spoke softly to her, apologizing for moving on, for finding love again, but also expressing his deep gratitude for the woman who had changed his life. "I hope you understand," he whispered. "I'll always love you, but she makes me want to live again." It was a quiet, personal moment, one that filled him with a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. At the church, the small gathering of friends and neighbors had arrived, filling the modest space with warmth despite the cold outside. The decorations were simple, winter flowers and candles, but there was a beauty in the simplicity that reflected the love they had found. The air buzzed with quiet excitement, and the warmth of the gathering did nothing to quiet Dustin's racing heart. As he waited at the altar, his thoughts kept returning to Georgia, to the woman who had chosen him, to the life they were about to build together. The doors creaked open, and every head turned as Georgia appeared in the doorway, her hand steady as she grasped the edge of the doorframe. For a moment, the entire world seemed to fall away, and all Dustin could see was her. She was stunning, not because of the dress or the ceremony or the whispers of admiration from the guests, but because she was the woman who had once been left behind and now stood before him, ready to begin a new life. She walked toward him, each step a declaration of strength, of choice. And as she moved closer, Dustin felt his heart catch in his throat. There was no father to walk her down the aisle. She had refused the offer, choosing instead to walk alone, to make her own path. Her gaze never wavered from his as she approached, her eyes filled with both fear and determination. When she reached the altar, Dustin could hardly speak, his throat tight with emotion. He reached for her hands, the warmth of her skin grounding him. The sheriff, standing at the front, began the ceremony, his voice steady as he spoke the familiar words of union. "We gather here today," he said, "to witness the joining of two souls, two hearts, who have weathered their own storms and now choose to face the future together." When it was time to exchange vows, Dustin's voice was strong, though it trembled slightly with the weight of the promises he was about to make. "Georgia," he began, his eyes never leaving hers, "I vow to choose you every day, to see you when others can't, to protect you when the world is unkind, and to love you not despite your past, but because of it. You are my home, and I will build a life with you, one that's ours." George's heart swelled as she listened to his words, her own emotions threatening to overwhelm her. When it was her turn, her voice was steady despite the tears that filled her eyes. "Dustin," she said, her voice soft but clear. I vow to choose you every day, to trust you when fear whispers in my ear, to lift you up when grief pulls you down, and to honor your past as we build our future. I promise to love you not because I need you, but because I choose you every single day. The vows were simple, yet they carried with them the weight of everything they had been through, everything they had overcome. As the ceremony came to an end, the sheriff pronounced them husband and wife. In the quiet that followed, Dustin leaned in to kiss her. The kiss was gentle at first, a soft promise of forever, but then it deepened, the passion and love they had both held back now fully realized. The guests erupted into applause, but all Georgia could hear was the sound of Dustin's heart beating against hers, the world around them fading into nothing. The reception that followed was small but filled with joy, the celebration intimate and warm. Georgia felt the weight of the day, of a new life they were about to start, and as they danced together, no music but their hearts as the beat, she knew that this was just the beginning. The next morning, as husband and wife, they rode back to the ranch together. Georgia, her heart full, looked out at the snow-covered land, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she belonged. No longer lost, no longer broken, she was home. As they entered the house, hand in hand, Dustin's arm wrapped around her waist, and she felt the promise of their future in every step they took. They had both been healed by love, and now they would face the world together. It was no longer about survival. It was about living, about choosing each other, and about the life they would build side by side.